Welcome to the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower. Let's dive into today's conversation regarding life's myriad transitions and how we refine our responses in our relationships, our wellness, our households, our work, and in our practices. You are invited to learn and love and listen with me. Welcome to Practice You. Welcome back to the podcast. I have one of my heroes here today. Her name is Elise Loehnen. She's the host of Pulling the Thread. She's co-written 12 books, 5 of which were New York Times bestsellers. She was, when I met her, the chief content officer of Goop. She co-hosted the Goop podcast, the Goop Lab on Netflix. Previously, she was the editorial projects director of Condé Nast Traveler and living in Los Angeles with husband and 2 boys. God bless you. I have 1, and that was plenty. We're here to talk about your book, which blew my mind. I own it on Kindle and in hardcover. It's called Honor Best Behavior. And the subtitle is The 7 Deadly Sins and the Price Women Pay to Be Good. I just want to give a shout out to whomever the artist was.
Thank you.
It's absolutely stunning. Wow. And you've got Lisa Taddeo and Gabor Maté and Terry Real, who I love. I only finally just met them, Terry and Belinda. And what he wrote is really, I think, salient for our listener today. With equal parts wit, wisdom, erudition, and warmth, Elise Loehnen guides us on a journey through history, culture, and our own psychologies to not just investigate the limiting effects of patriarchal thinking in women's lives, but to free them. Loehnen is half historical docent, half big sister with a hot cup of tea. Read this author and change your life. Terry Real, who has really basically made it his life's mission to dismantle the patriarchy. So this is a very, very good blurb. And I am so happy to have you here, Elise. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I am always happy to meet other Terry Real super fans because I think his work is so potent.
It's everything, actually. And the way he and Belinda function together. I had the occasion to drive them home from a dinner one night in Nosara, and we just could not have had a better chat.
Wait, did you go to that retreat with Esther Perel down there?
So I was there staying nearby, but I didn't attend that particular week. I was teaching yoga for the following week after him. So we got to have a little crossover socially, which was really, quite the gift.
Yeah, I'm jealous. I really wanted to go to that.
Come next year. There's like 3 or 4 weeks that are incredible at Blue Spirit called Wisdom and Wellness. And it's just so much fun. You get the wildest teachers there and like in full form, just the mundane daily, let's go have breakfast together and chat. Dan Siegel, let's go hang out. It was epic. I just want to jump right in because the book really blew my mind. I'm almost 54 this year and I started reading it last year after I turned 53. And there were tons of things that I didn't know. For example, the story, and we're putting on your historical docent cap for the moment. We're on page 11 of Honor Best Behavior for our listener. The roots of the 7 deadly sins are important to know about. The Greek-speaking monk named Evagrius Ponticus, who lived in 345 AD, okay, we're going back a ways, exiled himself to a monastery in the Egyptian desert to battle demons in his mind, which were basically that he had fallen in love with a married woman. And in Greek, the word demon translated to a life energy that wouldn't obey the rules. This is important to highlight, our listener. That part of ourselves that's impossible to control. So Evagrius was not so much imagining literal fire-breathing demonic beings as battling with his own natural inclination toward emotion or passion, but it was really about passions that might distract him from prayer. In response to these human instincts, he created a book of sayings called Talking Back, which sounds markedly modern.
The practicos.
Like, why don't we write that book? that's circulated among other monks. It's basically a collection of short pieces of scripture to be used as exhortations against these inner demons, like a spell book of sorts. And, they include gluttony, fornication, love of money, sadness, anger, listlessness, vainglory, and pride. This particular list, 2 centuries later, Pope Gregory in the year 540 to 604, somewhere in that realm, crystallized this list into the capital vices. Okay? Vainglory, envy, anger, melancholy, avarice, gluttony, and lust. It's morphing again. Sloth will replace sadness at one point. So sad that sadness was excommunicated, as we know, and then you've re-included it in your book, which was so smart of you. Pope Gregory's version became the 7 deadly sins. And, by the way, he assigned them all to Mary Magdalene and branded her a whore, conflating Mary Magdalene with the quote-unquote sinful woman. And here's where, fellow woman listener, our story begins.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
I know.
And when I read this, I was just like, what on earth have we been fighting all this time? This random collection, this list made by a man so many hundreds of years ago. For what?
Yeah. And then interpreted over time and passed down to us as this list of what it is to be a good woman. And you don't have to abide by these or subscribe to these ideas for them to be in you. That's the most important part. As someone who was raised in a secular household, I had to look up the sins. And then I didn't know any of this before I started working on the book, that they weren't even in the Bible. I thought they were so core to scripture that of course they were everywhere. But no, they came from the same man who actually is one of the early fathers of the Enneagram. And I'm so glad you mentioned that word daemon, because people will recognize it. Anyone who loves sort of Jung or like James Hillman and his work on how essential the daemon is, this like whatever it is that wants to be expressed through us. And you have to listen. You have to listen. You can't repress, ignore, suppress, deny, or pretend like these very vital forces aren't a part of who you are and your expression in the world.
Yep. And I'm now on page 21, quoting you. The good news for all of us is that the feminine, the goddess in all her forms, does not enjoy suppression.
No.
She invariably rises. We are feeling this now. Patriarchy taught us to valorize the masculine, to see it as a redeeming force, as divine. These qualities in our culture have been horribly overdeveloped, with devastating consequences for us all. And it is imperative that women reclaim our precious energy so we can bring forward the feminine principle with the full force required to rebalance society's ills. And being somebody that works in a level 2 men's penitentiary, I can tell you the overdevelopment of the masculine is present in every fiber of every man who is currently experiencing incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's exactly what got them there.
Yeah. And the central sort of core thesis of the book is that women are conditioned for goodness and men are conditioned for power. And these are the socially constructed ideas of these words, not, I would say, their spiritual value, which is different. And the book isn't really about men, but as you mentioned, I write about sadness and I write a lot about Terry Real's work. And I think we all know, all women know, that patriarchy, even though it would seem to benefit men in the sense of giving them more power in this patriarchal world, it's destroying them. It's as insidious and terrible for men as it is for women.
Of course, I'm going to go to envy. It's something that you write about very often in your Substack, which I want to recommend strongly to our listener. It's one of the very few that I actually get a paid subscription to. Elise is just so dang smart. Her writing is so solid, and she's super committed, if I may speak about you, as though you're not here, to making sure that women are coming together to learn and to thrive. And in this particular episode of your Substack, let's say, you had spent part of the previous week in Charlottesville with a group of incredible women. Dinner the first night, the conversation, of course, turned to the envy chapter of this book. Every chat about the book unfailingly tends to go here. This is the chapter about women's covert and undiagnosed wanting, and how we tend to deride and cut down the women who are provoking our envy, rather than recognizing that our dislike and aversion is not about them at all. It's that these women are simply holding up a mirror for us and pushing on a dream we have for ourselves. So beautiful. Oh my God. And this isn't even the book, that's her Substack, listener. I've experienced this a handful of times, and these are deep scars that do not disappear. I have to sit for hours to find within myself the confidence to rise above these scars, some of which are many, many years old. And I want to talk about this because this is actually, for our listener, important distinction. This is a part of our women's internalized patriarchy. And we have to talk about this, as you've said. What are some of the ways in which you find yourself working through and with this in your own life? What are your commitments around it?
Yeah. I mean, I write about envy as really the gateway to the other sins. And in many ways, the gateway to the book. It was part of the genesis of the idea for the book. And as people are listening, it's important to remember that so many of these scripts that run us and that control our behavior are not part of our conscious minds. So you might be listening and saying, I don't have envy. That was my immediate reaction when I heard it. Ew, gross. I would never, not me. And this was in response to a line from Lori Gottlieb, and maybe you should talk to someone. She just says a very simple statement that she tells her clients to pay attention to their envy because it shows them what they want. And there was something about that sentence, very simply stated, that I couldn't stop thinking about, both because I had that reaction, ooh, envy, no, I don't have any envy. And then it also raised a question for me of, I actually couldn't tell you what I want because I have been so driven throughout my life, so performative, but not really according to my own internal GPS necessarily. Although I think I've always worked sort of in concordance with the universe or some sort of higher force. What I've done has not been what I've wanted. It's where I've needed to sort of be. You know, it's why I've ghostwritten 12 books before writing my own book, et cetera. So in that process of identifying that clearly I had envy and I didn't even know how to identify it in myself, or I was unwilling to look at it, and that I didn't know what I wanted, I started to pay attention to myself. And I noticed, unfortunately, shamefully, that I would deprecate or disparage other women. Maybe it was a woman whose book was on the New York Times bestseller list, and I would say something like, I didn't think that book was very good, or I don't understand why people think she's so great, or I don't really like her, or she bugs me the wrong way. All these sort of general descriptions that we use a lot in our speech, particularly about other women, where we're not citing specific behavior. We're saying, like, she rubs me the wrong way. And it's really sort of a, why her and not me? Who does she think she is, et cetera. There's so much information in it. And as soon as I started paying attention to myself, seeing what I was up to, I could find the contrails of envy everywhere that were like a giant blinking neon sign saying, you want this too. She is doing something that you want. And all the sins, Venn diagram with each other, pride and envy are very related. We're scared of being seen for good reason as women in our culture, being visible in whatever our sphere is, because we're very quick to destroy women who dare to be seen and to put them back in their place. We don't want to inspire women's envy because we know they'll come for us. And then also scarcity and greed, and this idea that there's really only room for one. And if she has it, then I can't have it too. And that in order to have it, I need to displace her, dethrone her, destroy her. This is so in us. It is so insidious. And sometimes it's real. Scarcity is real for a lot of women, but we continue to promulgate it, promote it, reinforce it for ourselves and for each other because we're just unconsciously acting this out. And it is such a painful wound. Every time I take the book to a group of women who have read it, they only really want to talk about envy, or it has to end there, or it has to be a significant part of the conversation, because we feel so hurt by other women, even as we love women, right? And I think right now we're in this moment of culture where it's like, let's not look at this. This is against the narrative that we're trying to push forward, that we're a sisterhood and that women support women. We don't want to acknowledge this because it feels like an old, tired trope. But until we let it come up and recognize why this has been our inclination, we'll never move past it.
And the why comes in the witch trials from ages ago. Let's talk a little bit about that, just in case our listeners are not planning on reading the book. I was so transfixed, mesmerized by this. These witch trials moved women to rat out their sisters, their kids, their mothers. There was a period of time where all women had to look over their shoulders because somebody might give them up as a witch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We think about in this country, the Salem witch trials, and I think it's like 25 or 30 people died. It was not a protracted amount of time that this happened in North America. But across Europe, the witch craze, the witch hunt, followed the Inquisition and followed similar playbooks. It went on for centuries, and we'll never know how many people died. It was primarily women, but some men died as well. But historians estimate maybe 80 to 100,000 people.
Wow.
So you think about that protracted trauma over many, many generations. And it's what you just said. It's neighbors turning in neighbors. It's scapegoating, projection, and fear of women, particularly women who would gather together. It sort of marks this moment when collective child rearing, when things really started to become patriarchal and aligned under a nuclear family, and women were not only torn away from each other, but potentially turned into mortal enemies. And I think as we come to understand trauma and intergenerational trauma more and its epigenetic lineage in us, the way that we carry this. And I think that, in our culture, we're becoming more and more literate about this. But you have to imagine how many of us carry this in our ancestral line, this wariness of other women, this fear, this threat. I don't know how we begin to address it outside of wondering or questioning whether it might not still be quite present in our culture today.
Yeah. I found actually just a great deal of kindness and compassion go a long way. And even when I was the victim of someone's woman on woman ire, I just threw myself wholeheartedly into apologizing, doing the best that I could to make it right. And that quieted the situation down. Like, that's all I've got. I wish had I had another chance to do it over differently, I would have done it differently. In certain cases, it's a little bit less black and white and clear. But for the most part, I think as we get older too, it becomes easier to just throw compassion out of my chest in the direction where it is needed and mean it and hope for the best.
It's beautiful. Well, I think it's like, and working with people like you, people who are doing body-based practices, the more we can become present with what's in us, and even to stop and say, what is alive in me right now? What is this? Like, can I let this come up? Can I understand what this is before I repress it, suppress it, or project it onto someone else and deprecate them to make myself feel better, or unload on them, or blame them, or whatever it might be? The more body aware I think that we can become, and the more, as you said, sort of compassionate and generous with ourselves and with each other, the faster we can move through it.
Speaking of this, page 224 that I've marked for us, how anger shows up as social aggression in girls. I know that at least one of our listeners today is raising a girl. She's turning 13, 14, 15. She's dealing with this girl-on-girl hatred. I hear it from all the parents of girls that I know, pretty much without exception. Our cultural ineptitude around anger means we fail to teach our children how to appropriately express it too, you write. While we recognize aggression in its physical and verbal forms, there's a third type, social aggression, otherwise known as gossip, alliance building, silent treatment, exclusion. We socialize boys to the first two types, boys will be boys. We socialize girls to the third, the least confrontational. And while we teach girls to be nice, praise-seeking, good girls, as anyone who has encountered the barbed edges of female friendships in grade school and occasionally as adults can testify, repercussions from this training can be long-lasting and devastating. Women can behave in ways that are cruel. And just because social aggression might be the more passive doesn't make it less hurtful than getting punched in the face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder, you actually quoted Amanda Ripley in High Conflict, which I've read and I loved. More than 5,000 people have now participated in these particular studies across 62 countries. Some of these people had their brain scanned while they played. These were cyberball studies in which there are two researchers in the waiting room. Unbeknownst to the participant, the researchers start tossing a ball between all three people, and then, without comment, they leave the participant out, who looks invariably stricken and stressed, starts searching the room or their bag for something to do, for distraction. And these scans of that participant show heightened brain activity in the same areas triggered by physical pain. It hurts to be left out. And I think it's important for a mom of a girl, maybe listening right now, this is important information for you to have, maybe to talk to your girl about not leaving anybody out, or what if she's the victim and how to manage that. And I thought it might be interesting to ask you this question. I don't know if you have any familiarity with nonviolent communication, but it feels really apt here.
Nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love his work. And I wrote about it a little bit in part because I feel like he has really excellent scripts for how to communicate anger based on needs.
Yep.
Rather than just erupting. But I'm so glad you mentioned sort of what happens to girls, because I think that, so much of this book is about nature and culture and how we'll never really know who we are, but we very much know the stories that are told about who we are and what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man. And obviously we're chafing against that and bucking against that as a larger culture to say, wait, this is far more complicated and far more creative than this. And the reality is this isn't new. This is how we've always been. But what happens with girls and aggression is boys and girls are both incredibly aggressive and full of anger. I mean, think about a crying baby. It's not that girl babies are compliant, docile, obedient, and silent, right?
Right.
And then it's socialized out of us. So girls, starting when they're very young, 2, 3, start to understand and model their behavior based on what they see around them and how girls behave. And then when we see covert aggression, when we see mean girls, when we see queen bees and wannabes and all of these sociological studies, what we hear from that is this is how girls are, rather than, no, this is how girls are socialized to behave.
That's right.
So the more we can reconnect ourselves with our very potent and real anger and learn how to work with it, understand it, express it, assert our needs and our boundaries. One of the lines from nonviolent communication is, I am angry because I am needing fill in the blank.
Yep.
And that is so powerful because you can't just react. You can't just erupt. I mean, you can, but if you're talking to your partner or talking to someone, to say, this is what the need is that's not being met is far more productive than how dare you not take the trash out.
Right. There's an element also of nonviolent communication. I learned with one of Marshall's students, a woman by the name of Judith Hanson Lassiter, who's in her late 70s. She's awesome. And she teaches for the first, several episodes of her classes, she teaches self-empathy. And I was thinking that it might be useful for the women who perhaps are raising girls, or a girl listening to this, a woman listening to this who's been through it. The first step is to observe, when that was said, I felt angry, scared, sad, disappointed, confused, put out because my need for order, compassion, connection, mutuality was not met. And then to give oneself empathy, one would just make that whole observation, recognize what's going on and say, how human of me to feel this way. How human of me to feel left out. How human of me to feel scared, distracted, freaked out, frustrated, whatever it is. And that whole process of giving myself empathy for me personally is such a balm.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's really helpful. And then, of course, it does move into what one does when one is communicating with somebody else. As you mentioned, when I heard you say this, I felt X because my need for Y was not met. May I make a request? And I literally have not had a fight with my boyfriend in over a year because we just do this. And we've been together for 10 years.
That's amazing.
I know.
And not surprising. Because when you hear that, when you hear the need and the frustration, but really the need, you can meet the need without needing to defend yourself.
100%.
Yeah.
And that takes all the scarcity out of the equation, back to scarcity, and brings two people together in a way that is, teamwork. Gosh. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about, which was the recent Substack that you had on ending the manel. Think of our listener, think of the word panel. Go ahead. And then put an M instead of the P, and you've got the manel. And guess what's happening?
Yeah.
Guess what's happening? It is bonkers to hear. Elise figured this out. Dinner that night in Charlottesville, your friend Valeria told you about the work she'd been involved with in Africa. 25 civic leaders from across the continent gathered for a 6-week leadership training to fight against gender-based violence, including genital mutilation. Everything was touched on: DEI, leadership, design thinking. At the end of this program, this group of 25 fellows, half people who identified as men and half people who identified as women, assembled a panel to represent their thinking about how to help African women. Okay, what emerged? A panel of 6 men, which is basically a manel, with a woman moderating the conversation. Like, how is this possible that 6 men could talk about women with any experience at all? You go on to say that this story doesn't shock you. None of the participants actually even noticed their bias in action. So many of your female friends listen to wildly popular podcasters like Peter Attia, Andrew Huberman, Sam Harris, Tim Ferriss. Oops. These are all white men. Whoops. In passing, Huberman told Time magazine that half his listenership is women. And nobody has noticed that all of these most popular podcasters are men, and most notably white men. So you did an audit of all these shows. Almost every big male podcaster in the loosely categorized health and wellness space who interviews experts posts similar guesting rates, like mostly men on their vastly men in their guest list. Then they start having each other on as guests. I'm not criticizing. I'm just making notes, stating facts. Here are the numbers. Sam Harris has had 376 episodes. By the way, I like Sam Harris. Spanning across a decade, he'd hosted fewer than 60 women, about 15%. Tim Ferriss had platformed fewer than 100 women across nearly 700 episodes. Dr. Peter Attia, only 28 women across 300 episodes were worth interviewing, one being his young daughter. And in 2 years as a weekly podcast host, Andrew Huberman had interviewed only a dozen women, and mostly on like women's hormones and women's issues.
Yeah.
And that's notable, that when female researchers and physicians are invited onto these shows, they're always talking about like gender things.
Yes. Very rarely as experts across genders about health in general.
And here's the funniest bit, which is why I ended up printing this article. A picture of Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia, where Peter was the guest on Andrew's podcast. And between these two faces of men, read, "Hormone replacement therapy for women. on menstruation, menopause, and hormone replacement therapy for women. Like, what is happening? What the actual?
Is happening? Yes. And then I ended up turning that piece into a 4-part series because it had its own sort of small viral moment.
Yes.
And some women were like, well, it's great that they're talking about women's health. It's like, well, actually, women are far outpacing men in education, and we have been for centuries. And there are far more women are outpacing men in earning MDs, DOs, PhDs in the biomedical sciences, legions of female experts who have devoted their life to menopause, female brain health, and other categories, obviously, as well. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist, yes, who specializes in the optic nerve. And Peter Attia, calls himself a longevity doctor who focused on general surgery. I don't actually think he is board certified, which is fine. I'm not intending to disparage them. They're very smart. But they are so over their skis too. It's like, yes, you can look at research theoretically, but this is not the focus of your lives. This isn't your area of expertise. So to present yourself as sort of core experts on menstruation and HRT and menopause is bonkers when there are so many men and women are experts in this space and publish studies or work with the patient population.
And why? I ask.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they interview those humans?
Yes.
Instead of interviewing one another is beyond me when neither has a uterus.
Nope. Nor has done any focused research or study into this either. And the reason I wanted to do it was, one, slightly shame the men because I know they know, but I really just wanted to make it transparent to all of us because we are so used to hearing men like that as experts and authorities. And we just keep perpetuating this idea that these men are the experts and we're not, when in reality, the data says otherwise. But we are all participating in this too. I listened to those podcasts. I didn't realize until, last year, 2 years ago, when someone said to me, you should try to be on Sam Harris's podcast. And I had sort of an unconscious reflexive answer, which was, oh, he doesn't interview women. And then I said, wait, is that true? And then I looked and realized that, yes, that's pretty accurate.
It is accurate. It's frightening. And also, as you said, not to disparage them, but I think it would be worth, if any of them ever caught wind of this, to just make a request like, hey, guys, this feels really strange, confusing, perpetuating the patriarchy, this business. And would you mind, deferring to women?
Yes.
Would you mind?
Yes.
That would be
over-indexing.
Great.
Yeah. 100%. I will say that a shout out to Dan Harris on 10% Happier because he does an exceptional job of programming his podcast. And I just looked at gender because it would be, I promise, appalling to look at all other sort of demographic factors on these guys' podcasts. But Dan Harris does an exceptional job across every measure. It's so well representative. And doesn't suffer in popularity. Let me just add that.
Yep. No, he's great. They're brothers, right? Those two.
I don't think that they're related. Are they related?
Dan Harris and Sam Harris. I need to look that up. I feel like I learned that somewhere, that they are, in fact, brothers.
Maybe.
I want to turn our attention to your Substack for a second because that's a place where I find a lot of value. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing there. And I would like to offer to our listeners some insight as to the sort of popular response when I say, hey, have you seen Substack yet? And I typically hear something in the realm of, oh God, another thing? I don't have time for that. And I just want to say to our listener that Substack happens to be, at least in my opinion, a place where really a lot of good information is shared with humility and elegance, easily, quickly, swiftly, and you can actually earn money for your writing. And that has not been possible previously. I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you managed to pull that all together from the various parts of your life and make it a consistent offering.
Yeah, I love Substack. I've become a big proselytizer because essentially it's, yes, it's a network and a community in some ways. Like you can really easily discover other writers who the writers that you like follow, and you can also see what other people are reading or engaging with. But it's essentially a platform which makes it very, very easy to publish what's essentially a blog, slightly more organized than that, and to attach it to email. So for writers, otherwise you're paying for your website, you're paying MailChimp to send out an email or Squarespace, et cetera. Substack has sort of taken all of the complexity out of it and makes it just very simple for anyone to set it up. It's truly democratized. There's Patti Smith is on there. I mean, amazing people are on there across genres doing totally different things. And as an author, you can publish very easily. It's not fancy. There's not a lot of bells and whistles, which I find reassuring and nice. It means that I've gotten into the flow of just doing it every week. And then people can pay you. They don't have to. There's free versions always. But I found that to be the nicest hug as someone who's hosted a podcast and written for free for a long time, that people are really happy to pay, which is very warm. I really like it there a lot.
Same. I managed to get a whole year of a weekly writing and even some extras. And it was like a really sweet extra little income that I ended up donating in its entirety to somebody I really care about.
Oh, that's amazing.
It was amazing, actually. I would love to, just in case we have one or two listeners who are interested in pursuing their own Substack, final 2 questions. What would be the best sort of balance ratio between free posts on Substack and paid posts?
Yeah. So I set up, initially I had this reaction of shame, I write about it in the Greed chapter of, I feel bad asking anyone to pay me. And then the Substack person who helped me onboard was like, just turn it on and see what happens. And I still pretty much almost exclusively write everything for free. And people can opt in to pay or not. And then what I do behind the paywall is my archive is behind the paywall, and everything I write is quite evergreen. And I link back to old things that I've written as well. So I think after 2 months, everything goes behind a paywall. And then I host an occasional sort of open office hours, or I do a workshop. I have one coming up on Kabbalah and tarot with this man, Mark Warren, or I did something on the I Ching with a Jungian who works with the I Ching. So people have to pay to access that. But I comp a lot of subscriptions. Anyone who can afford it, I'm happy to give people a free subscription. So I've just sort of found ways to offer extra enticements for people who pay for the Substack. But some people do sort of a mix of half and half, or if they're doing a really long piece, they'll paywall it. You can play around, you can take paywalls off. It's very, very, very flexible. But I think for a writer, just getting in the practice of publishing weekly, it's a great exercise. And it's also, for me, been very helpful to not question my own thinking, but sometimes I'll write something and I'll be like, is this worth anything? Like, I don't know, this might be silly. And people love it, or vice versa. And that's, I think, helpful feedback. I don't write to sort of please people necessarily, but sometimes it's nice to be reminded of, like a simple, very short newsletter is sometimes all people really can metabolize. And people like it when it's a simple idea and a simple newsletter.
I appreciated a recent podcast of yours that was about 30 minutes long with a bunch of ideas in it. And I listened to it in a bath, and I listened to it again when I was walking, and it was just super helpful, like just short and sweet. I think what you're saying in terms of having everything be readable and then putting it behind a paywall after a certain amount of time is a really nice practice. I'm playing with 1 free post a month, and then the rest are paid. So it's an interesting thing. I think I'm going to give a free month in April of pieces of my poetry from my book and see how people respond to that. But yeah, it's nice to play. It's nice to know that you can change it if you want. And I resonate with everything you said.
Yeah.
The last thing I'd like to do is read from the back of the book, Lisa Tadeo's blurb on the book to close us out and to leave our listener with Some pretty serious inspiration. Lisa Taddeo, if you're not familiar, is the New York Times bestselling author of 3 Women. That book is sitting next to my bed. It's next up in the queue. A stunning, big, and bold encyclopedia for how to live. The first post-pandemic book to take our latest measurements and provide something fresh to comfort, embolden, enlighten, and enrich who we are today. On Our Best Behavior is nothing short of a tangible necessity in our new intangible world. Dang, sister. What a blessing that is, that little blurb right there. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful for the level of research and diligence that you had to practice to write this book on behalf of all women who have read this book. We thank you. And we honor your mind and your heart.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, indeed.